Secretary James A. Baker III is being honored here this afternoon with us, and he likes his introductions extremely brief. So, he was the 61st Secretary of State serving under President George H.W. Bush. His principal accomplishments: facilitating the end of the Cold War, negotiating the reunification of Germany, helping the coalition to eject Saddam's troops from Kuwait in the first Gulf War, and orchestrating the Madrid Conference, which brought Israel and its Arab neighbors to the peace table for the first time. Secretary Baker will be joined by Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, who with his wife, Susan Glasser, now of the New Yorker, are writing a biography of Secretary Baker called The Man Who Ran Washington. Indeed he did. Secretary Baker, Peter, please come to the stage.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. What a great crowd. This is terrific. It's a sunny day. I can think of all kinds of nice things to do outside, but you're here with us, and it's a great treat to be here with you. It's also a great honor for me to get a chance to talk with Secretary Baker here on stage. I want to start by making very clear a disclosure: no relation. We are the Greek Bakers. He is the Texas Bakers. But we have spent a lot of time together over the last 6 years. He's been very generous and gracious with his time, as has Mrs. Baker, as have all of Mr. Baker's children and relatives and friends and advisors who have cooperated with us on this project. We actually wanted to call the book The Man Who Ran Washington When Washington Ran the World, which I think actually captures a little bit more of the moment in time when Secretary Baker was in office. We couldn't fit all those words on the cover. So when you see the book, just pretend that the other words are there. And the thing that makes his story, I think, so fascinating and important is it also tells the story of Washington, the story of the United States, through a period of rather remarkable change, and the story of the world itself, our interaction with it. Nothing more dramatic, probably, than the night the Berlin Wall fell, right? We remember, everybody who's of a certain age remembers where they were when the JFK assassination happened, where 9/11 happened. But the Berlin Wall is a moment we all remember that was a good thing. That was a positive thing. It was a reaffirming moment. Tell us a little bit about, looking back at it 30 years later, sir, what do you think is the lesson of that moment to us today? As we think about it, 3 days. It was only up for 28 years. We've now had further time since the wall was up than it actually spent up, and yet it felt so permanent at the time.
I think, Peter, that one of the lessons we ought to take away from that is that the desire for freedom and individual liberty is extraordinarily strong and pervasive, and exist in the hearts and minds of most people around the world. People ask me all the time, which president was most responsible for the fall of the Berlin Wall? And I say all of them, from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush, because they all pursued a policy that was dedicated to the idea that the paradigm we embraced in America, that is democracy and free markets, was far superior to the paradigm of communism and statist economies, centrally planned economies. So I think every American president, from Truman through George H.W. Bush, deserves credit for the fact that the West was the West's ideas and principles and values and beliefs were triumphant. The indomitable spirit of those people of the captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe is what really, I think, more than anything else, brought about the result that we see today.
Do you think there's been some retrenchment? Some people feel in Eastern Europe, some of the states of Eastern Europe may be pulling back a little bit from some of the democratic institutions that they've built up. What do you think is happening, and why do you think that's happening?
I think that there is some of that. I think there is a tendency today in some countries toward more populism, more authoritarianism, more of a desire perhaps to control the lives of the citizens of the countries involved than there ought to be. I think that's regrettable. I do think it's happening. It's happening in some places in Europe. It's happening in some other places in the world as well. So I think that you're right about that there's a tendency. I don't suggest for 1 minute that there's any sort of a move away from the principles of democracy and free markets here and among our closest allies, whether they're in Asia or in Europe. I think, regrettably, there's a tendency today not to appreciate the importance of those alliances to the strength of America and to America's leadership role in the world. I think, say this all the time in speeches, and I wrote it in my book, that it's really important that America be involved. When we're involved, I happen to believe we have been and are a force for peace and stability around the world. I don't mean necessarily military involvement, although there could be and would be some of that. I just mean involved, and those alliances were one way for us to be involved and be a force for good. I take great solace in the fact of looking back. I was just saying to some people at my table, Susan and I just came back from France, where we followed in the footsteps of my father, who was an infantry officer in World War I and fought in the biggest battles Americans fought in that war, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And it was dramatic. It was an extraordinarily poignant visit. There are all these trenches are still there. The German trenches are there. The Allied trenches are there. The foxholes are there, and monuments to the dead Americans. And those of you who are Americans out there, at some point you need to see how the Battle Monuments Commission honors the fallen of this country who've done so much to bring peace to the world. So I think it's really important that we try to continue to remain involved. We should not pull back and become isolationist. We did that after World War I, and the result was the Great Depression and World War II. And lastly, I would say that a successor of mine as Secretary of State was Colin Powell, with whom I worked closely when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs and I was Secretary of State. And Colin once said, you know, we Americans have fought 3 wars in the last century, 2 hot ones and a cold one. And we've never asked for anything more than enough ground to bury our dead. And I hope that view will continue to prevail in the United States, and that we will want to continue to be involved, and that our allies will want us involved. And I worry, I was talking just a minute ago. Last night I had dinner at the Diplomacy Center Museum in the State Department. The ambassador of Germany was there. We were talking about our concern about the transatlantic alliance and that it may be fraying on the edges. And I said, and this was a pretty self-serving statement, I'm no longer a diplomat, so I can make it. I'm too old and too far out of government that I have any restrictions on what I say. But I said, you know, when America was involved a lot more than we are today, we were a force for good as well for you Europeans, because the transatlantic alliance constrained some tendencies on the part of some European countries to do what they've historically done, and that is fight each other. So it's really important that this alliance be maintained and be strengthened.
Well, I was in doing research for the book. I spent a lot of time at Secretary Baker's archives in Princeton, and I found a memo the other day, actually, that you sent to President Bush in 1991. He was getting ready to run for re-election. He had a challenge from the right, from a candidate who was using the very phrase, America first.
Yeah.
You'll remember that.
Yes, I do.
And you sent him a memo, you sent a column from David Broder saying that this should be something that President Bush should wage a vigorous debate against, that America first was not the approach then. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think it's working today. Is this an America first approach in our current foreign policy? And if so, what's wrong with it?
Well, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. I have no problem at all with America first. Any country ought to put the interests of their country first, and certainly we should. But that should not mean a withdrawing from engagement with the rest of the world. It should not mean protectionism. It should not mean isolationism. We're way beyond that. And globalism, in my view, is here to stay. I don't think it's a bad thing. Some people do. But whether it is or not, it's here to stay. So you have to define what you mean by America first. If it means protectionism and isolationism, that's not good. If it means you're going to put the interest of your country first above others, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. So we've seen lately, though, you and I have talked about the idea that we have had a long series of wars that haven't necessarily produced as much as we would have hoped they would have produced. Maybe it's time to rethink them. That's one area where you and President Trump, I think, share a thought. But he recently pulled troops out of Syria in a way that then cleared the way for the Turks to come in. I wonder if you have a feeling about that, given what you're talking about American leadership. How does that fit in?
Well, I don't think that was the way to, if you were going to, it's nothing wrong with campaigning on a platform of, I'm going to bring the boys home, okay? And that will appeal to a lot of people in whatever country you're in. And there's nothing wrong with trying to fulfill that campaign promise, provided you do it in the right way. I don't think this was the way to do it. You don't do it ad hoc and impulsively and on the spur of the moment. You do it after considerable discussion among the various elements of your government, the experts in the Defense Department, the State Department, CIA, whatever it is, and you do it in an orderly way, and you do it in a way in which the people who are going to be directly affected get a heads up. Okay, so this is generating some questions in the minds of long-term allies of ours, and I won't mention the countries now, but you all know who they are saying, wait a minute, will America be there? If we align with them, are they going to be there when we need them?
You brought together Arabs and Israelis at the table in Madrid. It was the first time Israel sat down with all of its Arab neighbors. What do you see today as the prospects for progress on Middle East peace? Is that just, have we reached a status of, okay, all right. Well, short answer. What would it take to change that?
I regret that, but I think that's where we are.
What would it take to change that? Is that something America can do, or is it something, frankly, that we're not able to?
More than anything else, it's something that the Israeli body politic has to do. My view for many years after I left office was that the Israeli people were tired of being a nation perpetually at war, and that they would find a way to negotiate a secure peace with the Palestinians. I don't think they'll ever have peace as long as they remain in occupation of those Arab lands. And the only solution, in my view, is the one that's been kicked around now for 40 or 50 years, and that's UN Resolutions 242 and 338, trade land for peace. That's why every American administration that I'm aware of has been opposed, Democratic or Republican, opposed to the establishment of Israeli settlements in Palestinian lands. And it's in Israel's interest to do this, because if Israel does not find a way to get a secure, and the Palestinians have to make sure they are on board for a secure peace, if Israel doesn't find a way to get that done, then she's going to have a terribly difficult time maintaining both her Jewish character and her democratic character, because demographics are going to overwhelm the Jewish population of Israel with Arab population. And unless they deny those Arabs equal rights, then there will be a minority. The Israelis will be a minority. So they've got to figure out some way to get there, and I've always thought they would, and I still hope they will. There could be a change in government in Israel after a long, long time. Bibi Netanyahu has been prime minister for a long time. Now you got a former chief of staff named Benny Gantz, who's been given a mandate by the president of Israel to see if he can put a government together, and he's trying to do so. That could conceivably change it. But the long-term interest of the state of Israel, and by the way, we will always be there for Israel. Mm-hmm. The United States is going to remain committed to the security of Israel. There'll be no change in that, regardless of which party is president.
We're going to open for questions in a few minutes in the audience. Just a couple more, though. You said globalization is here to stay. One of the legacies of the Bush, Baker, Reagan years was this really a bipartisan consensus on trade, the idea that free trade was a valuable thing. Democrats and Republicans had different ways of going about it, but the same general goal. You negotiated the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which became the basis for NAFTA, the foundation for NAFTA. What do you think of what's happening right now with China, our tariff war with China? Is this a healthy thing? Is it something that's going to get us someplace good, do you think, or is it?
Well, I have to say that I'm one of the people who fought hard to bring China into the WTO. Because our thinking at the time was if China becomes a member of the WTO, it will, first of all, it will carry out the commitments it makes to WTO, and it will be a more responsible member of the international community. I'm sorry to say I don't think that happened. I mean, to do business in China today, you have to give up a lot of your intellectual property, and there are other undertakings that the Chinese government agreed to when they acceded to the WTO that haven't been fulfilled. So I don't have any problem at all with an American president saying, hey, we need to have a fair playing field. Free trade is only good when it's fair trade as well. And so I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think a tariff war is the way to go about it. Mm-hmm. I think a tariff war can hurt the United States. To some extent, you could argue today it is hurting our farmers. We're having to subsidize our farmers directly from the taxpayer, from the U.S. Treasury, because of the losses that they're saving. So my sense was, I mean, what I was hoping would happen was that our administration would accede to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Trump, when he was campaigning, he, in effect, negated that. He didn't think it was a good agreement. I think it was, I worked a little bit on getting it implemented I did some things. It was for the Obama administration. They asked me to do some stuff, so there would be some Republicans out there, I think, supporting it. But it was more than just a trade, more than just an economic agreement. It was also a political agreement and strategic agreement, because it gave effect to America's leadership role in Asia. Now, we didn't join it, and the other countries out there, quite understandably, are doing their own thing in a partnership that doesn't include us. That's not good for us. So I would have, while I don't have any problem with somebody calling on China to live up to its commitments, I think it should have been done through the TPP and not through a tariff war.
When I was working on the book, I found another memo that I found really interesting. It was dated October of 1992, you know, when I'm going to ask you, of course. And you all were in the thick of a campaign for re-election. You had gone back to the White House as chief of staff. And at the time, Bill Clinton was being criticized for having gone to Moscow as a young man, for having protested the Vietnam War while in London. And 4 congressmen came in to talk to President Bush, and you were there with him, of course. And and I'm going to read you the memo that you wrote in October 1992. You wrote, "They wanted us to contact the Russians or the British to seek information on Bill Clinton's trip to Moscow." And you wrote, "I said we absolutely could not do that." And I admit the first time I saw that memo, it didn't strike me very much. But when I found it again a couple weeks ago, it kind of had a little bit of an interesting resonance. Tell me about this. What's wrong? What's absolutely could not do this? What's wrong with asking a foreign government?
So now you're going to write, here was a guy who really covered his ass, right? No, there's nothing wrong with conditioning foreign aid. We do it all the time. But you don't do it I don't think it's appropriate to do it with respect to something that involves your own personal political interest, particularly if it runs counter to what the country's policy approach is. That's all I meant.
Right.
And that's not to say that I agree with what's going on here. I don't. And I will turn political for a minute and tell you that I think the Democrats are making a big mistake, just like we Republicans did when we impeached Bill Clinton and paid for it at the ballot box. And I suspect, and as a Republican hope, that the Democrats will pay for it at the ballot box too, because here we are, 1 month from an election year, and we're not doing the people's business. We're not doing anything but fighting with each other the way we always do. You know, when I was up here, people would come to Washington to try and get elected representatives to try and get the people's business done. We don't seem to do that anymore. So I don't think that this, I regret what's going on now. And while I don't think it's never appropriate to condition the provision of aid, which is a policy objective of your country, on obtaining something that is directed to your own personal political interest. Now that answer doesn't assume that I know exactly what went on, because I don't. And we'll see whether that's what happened. My memo said we're not going to do it because that would be inappropriate.
All right, let's see if we got some questions here from the audience. I think we've got one from
Secretary Baker, the title of Peter's book, The Man Who Made Washington Work, or Who Ran Washington, was because you're a principled pragmatist. Is there anybody in today's political scene in Washington, D.C., who you think has that capacity to be a principled pragmatist, to be able to get things done the way you did?
Well, I think there are probably plenty of them up here. Whether or not the situation, circumstances will permit it is another question. I think there are people on both sides of the aisle. I don't want to get into a name game here, but I can think of some Democrats who would really like to find a way to work with Republicans, and I can think of Republicans who would like to find a way to work with Democrats. But the environment has become not just toxic, but ugly. I don't know why anybody would come up here to do these jobs anymore, given where we are. And it's regrettable. It's terrible. We are politically dysfunctional as a nation. And I can give you a long list of reasons for that. And if you want them, I'll try to check them off quickly. First of all, we have to redistrict every 10 years. And so we draw districts further to the right in Republican-controlled states, further to the left in Democratic-controlled states, and we squeeze out the middle. And the responsible middle in American politics has disappeared. You rarely find any moderate Republicans anymore. We used to have a lot of moderate Republicans. We don't have many anymore. You also find a heck of a lot more way left Democrats than you used to. You look at some of these Democratic debates, and you tell me if you believe in the free enterprise system and how it works, you tell me if you feel comfortable with some of the stuff you hear on that stage. So you had redistricting. You've got the constitutional guarantee of free speech, which I fully support. But that means with the advent of the internet, which didn't exist back then, people can say the most outrageous things, throw them up on the wall, see what sticks, and then sooner or later the mainstream media will come along, pick up on it, and there's no rebutting it hardly. And then you got the situation where we're an evenly divided nation between blue states and red states. You have a situation where in the old days, people would bring their families up here. Today, Congress only works but from Tuesday afternoon to Thursday afternoon. Then they go home to raise money. So they don't bring their families. So you don't have any of the socialization across party lines that you used to have. And then finally, you've got a press today that's not a press. They're players in the political debate. You tune in to Fox News, you'd think you were listening to the House organ of the Republican Party. You tune in to CNN or MSNBC, you'd know you were listening to the House organ of the Democratic Party. That's not good for our democracy. We need to get back to a day when we had responsible journalism and responsible journalists like Peter Baker. I have to say that because he's writing a book.
He's got a
about
book, yeah, no, that's right. He's on the hook. How about over here? Sir, over here? Yeah. We hear
Secretary, Hank Paulson is talking about an economic Berlin Wall. And there's other analysts that are talking about a technological Cold War between China and the US. And in the end, it's a fight for supremacy, economic supremacy, which is understandable. Do you foresee a decoupling of the US economy with the Chinese economy, especially in relation with technology companies? And do you see, if you see that decoupling, where do you see those companies changing their supply lanes, their supply places too?
Well, I'm not sure there'll be an uncoupling. I think I said globalization is here to stay. And I think that you now have the supply streams and things like that are so integrated, it's going to be very hard to uncouple them. But I also have to say that I think it's time for fair play in trade. And I don't know how this thing looks to me like both sides are now moving toward trying to resolve this thing by each side's going to, as I understand recent news reports, reduce some tariffs. But it's not good for the global economy. It's not good for the economy in the United States, and it's not good for the Chinese economy. What's going on now?
Sir.
Yes, Mr. Secretary. My name is Ed Martins. I'm from World Boston. My question goes back to, you talk about our allies, especially in Europe, and this complaint certainly predates this administration. We're seeing more burden sharing, more of the Europeans, stepping up in these situations.
Say that a little slower.
Oh, I'm sorry. It goes to the question of burden sharing. You talked about the transatlantic
burden
alliance.
sharing, I got that.
Yeah, that the Europeans especially need to step up a little bit in terms of, we can't do everything. And I have one other question. You plan to join any of our previous speakers on Dancing with the Stars? Sean Spicer.
Would you want to be on Dancing with the Stars?
Sean Spicer was previous
Dancing
speaker.
with the Stars. No, I don't dance very well. My wife's here. She'll tell you that. But what was the other one?
Burden sharing with NATO.
Burden sharing. There's a place, sir, where I support President Trump. I support him in other ways as well. But there's a place where I support him, and it's particularly in the NATO burden sharing. It's not unreasonable for the United States to ask that our NATO partners pony up what they've agreed to pay, 2% of their GDP for defense. Very few of them have done so, and there ought to be some answer to that. We ought to find a way for them to do that, and we ought to encourage them to do it.
Over here, sir.
Sir, so you highlighted the positivity of U.S. interventionism.
Can you talk a little louder?
You highlighted.
Speak louder and slower.
So you highlighted the positivity of U.S. interventionism in Eastern Europe, but the same interventionism also occurred in Latin America during the Cold War. Do you think that these actions are still justified even if we overthrow Latin American countries that were democratically elected, like President Allende?
What about Latin America?
Intervention in Latin America during the Cold War, where we justified in some of our interventions in Latin America in overthrowing governments.
Was it justified in the Cold War, the intervention that we did in Latin America?
Well, so you highlighted on the U.S. interventionism and how positive it is and how you advocated for U.S. interventionism today.
I think he actually was talking about internationalism as opposed to interventionism, to make a distinction, right? Your point is not intervention in the military sense. Your point is America leading in a positive way, right?
Yeah. Are you talking about military intervention?
No, more like U.S. imperialism through foreign aid, such as.
Frankly, I think we should have been more involved in matters involving our hemisphere than we have been. Although, back in the days when I was here, we did a reasonably good job. And when I left office, there was only one non-democracy in this hemisphere, and that was Cuba. There had been quite a few, but I don't think there's any problem with our promoting our principles and values wherever we are, whether it's Latin America or somewhere else.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood his question.
Right. Sir.
Secretary Baker, Charles Shapiro, I had the honor of working with you at State Department. You were the boss. I was way down here.
That's what you think.
I will note that you have not aged since then, and I have. I caught up. My question is your relationship with the Career Foreign Service. Did you have any issues with the loyalty of the Foreign Service? Or?
Yeah, let me answer that for you, because I've thought about it since we've seen all the stuff we're now seeing. I would suggest to you we see that in a lot of administrations, okay? When I first came in, there was a lot of muttering because I surrounded myself on the 7th floor with a lot of people that I had known in my other iterations in government, Chief of Staff of the White House, Secretary of the Treasury, or that I'd known in political campaigns. And there was a lot of grumbling. And the Washington Post, the primary foreign policy correspondent for the Washington Post was a guy named Don Oberdorfer. You may remember.
Of course.
Don Oberdorfer was my classmate at Princeton University, and he wrote some of the worst stuff about how, hey, this guy doesn't know anything about foreign policy. Why is he head of the State Department? Well, I had to remind my pal Don that I had been Chief of Staff for 4 years and attended every National Security Council meeting that we had, and then I've been Treasury Secretary for 4, and I'd worked with most all of the leaders, certainly the economic leaders. So I really did have some. But the grumbling continued for about 4 months, and then all of a sudden, everybody in the building came to understand that because of my seamless relationship with President Bush, we were going to formulate and implement foreign policy for this country. And after that became apparent to everybody, the grumbling stopped totally.
Absolutely.
Because what the Foreign Service wants, the dedicated people of the Foreign Service, are so important to our country and to the, particularly the implementation, but also formulation of our foreign policy. And it's a real resource for the country. And all they want, really, is to be in the action. They don't want to be off to the side. And when they found out that because of my relationship with President Bush, that's where they'd be, all that grumbling stopped.
Do you think, let me interrupt here for a second, or add, Ambassador Yovanovitch was pulled back from Ukraine. A president has every right to have whoever they want as an ambassador, obviously, but she seems to have been treated in a way that most of the career Foreign Service feels was shabbily treated. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think you ought to treat anybody in that way. And certainly, but I can't, I don't know what the facts are there. That's an allegation right now. We'll see what the facts, but nobody should be treated like that.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I just want to return to the Latin American part again. Texas used to be Cuba's #1 trading partner once upon a time. Most of the Gulf Coast states were trading with Cuba. It's been about 60 years since we imposed the U.S. unilateral economic embargo on Cuba. There's been a change of administration there. It's a non-Castro who's been peacefully elected president. You can say what you will, but when you compare it to our best friend Saudi Arabia, there's what one could say is a true democratic sort of procession in Cuba, comparatively speaking. My question is, with the Trump administration's recent revitalization of the dreaded Helms-Burton Act that penalizes third parties from trading with Cuba, what is it going to take for the United States to truly normalize relations with our close island neighbor?
We need another Barack Obama to normalize relations with Cuba. But wait a minute. I didn't agree with what he did, so I'm sorry to say that to you. We didn't get anything for that. We gave everything, and we didn't get anything. So, without regard to the merits of the policy, if you're going to give up a policy, you ought to get something for it. There hadn't been one person released from political prison in Cuba since we made that deal. So it was not a good deal from my way of thinking, and I wouldn't have done it. My wife and I argue about this all the time.
All right. I'm told we have time for one more question right here. Sorry.
You made reference in your talk that the long-term solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis is Israel's willingness to give up the territory that they currently occupy. And I would say that Israel has made that attempt in the past, in 2005, when it gave back the Gaza Strip to the PLO. And shortly thereafter, Hamas gained control, and the Gaza Strip has sort of been a point of violence into Israeli from a rocket mortar perspective.
Yeah.
I would say part of the solution isn't just Israel giving up the territory they occupy, but also the PLO's ability to bring Hamas, under control. And so my question to you is, do you think that it's possible for the PLO to bring Hamas under control?
I don't know the answer to that, but you didn't listen to my answer very carefully. I said the land for peace approach is the only way I know that you're ever going to resolve that problem. And I said land for a secure peace, which requires the Palestinians. They're the ones that have to give on the security side. So you didn't, I don't think.
No, but see, that's my whole point. So far, the PLO over the years have not been able to bring Hamas under control. Every time the PLO would make 2 or 3 steps towards negotiations, Hamas would then...
I don't deny that, but what I'm saying to you is, I'm not suggesting Israel give up the land unless they get a secure peace for it.
But do you think that that's possible in terms of the PLO and Hamas?
I don't think it's possible today, as I indicated. Today, I think the stars are not aligned, either in Israel or among the Palestinians, to get that deal done. But that is the only deal, in my view, and I spent a lot of time on this problem, that's ever going to permit a secure peace.
Okay.
But it takes give on both sides. Israel's got to be willing to give up the land. The Palestinians have to be willing to provide a secure peace in exchange for that.
But do you think that Hamas is willing?
I think I got it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Look,
I don't know anything about Hamas. I don't know any Hamas people.
Okay. Well, listen. Thank you guys for. I know. I'm afraid our time is up, and we have to go. I apologize to those who wanted to ask questions. There's so many questions that could be asked. But thank you, Secretary Baker, for taking the time for this conversation. Thank you.